Welcome to Inside Minneapolis. The format this time is a little bit special. We're going to be meeting with the grandson of Theodore Wirth, the man who built a legacy here in the Minneapolis Park System. We're standing here in the historic Lyndale farmstead, and over my shoulder is a house built in 1910 for Theodore Wirth. Let's go inside and meet Ted right after we learn this interesting fact. Getting in the plane and we're about ready to go.
Think they got it organized?
I think so. Sure.
They're the newcomers.
And we're back. We're in the house that we referred to. Of course, this was a house that was built for Theodore Wirth, and that Did You Know you just saw cited some impressive statistics about the legacy that Theodore Wirth left behind here in Minneapolis. And we're very pleased in this edition of Inside Minneapolis to have with us a very special guest, Ted Wirth, the grandson of Theodore Wirth. Ted, it's really nice to have you here.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. And let's just start right out, because I think a lot of our viewers know that Theodore Wirth had something to do with the park system here, but they don't know any of the details. And it wasn't by chance that he ended up here. Why did Theodore Wirth come to Minneapolis?
Well, he was asked first, but it took him a long time to decide because he was located in Hartford, Connecticut, superintendent of parks for the Hartford. And he had quite a program, which included building, designing, and building. In 1904, pardon me, the first public rose garden in the United States, in Elizabeth Park. But it really goes back before that. You got to think of put yourself in that time, 1800s, 1870 and 80s. We were still fighting Indians in Montana.
Yeah.
And this town was listen to me, this city was beginning to feel its oats and grow and industrialize, but there were still people said that the town would never grow beyond the lakes. Calhoun.
That would sort of encompass it and
yeah, they just said
it
it isn't going to get to be a big city.
Yeah.
But there were others like Mr. Loring who had a different vision. They envisioned a large metropolitan area, not unlike Chicago, Detroit, and other cities. And we have a book that was written in 1873 by H.W.S. Cleveland. And it's called Landscape Architecture.
Oh, and this is the very book?
Yeah.
Right here. Oh, my word. Look at this. That's beautiful.
That's where my tabs in there because I used it.
Some reference tabs.
Yes.
Yeah, good for you.
But because we have a copy of this and presented and signed by Mr. Cleveland to Mr. Loring sometime in 1883. I think that's it. I'm looking at my coach over there.
Yeah.
And he read this book, and in this book it has a philosophy of development of this great hinterland, of the big woods. Minneapolis was on the threshold of this vast western expanse of land, and he was concerned about how we treat it and how we develop it, and that you can't do just what you've been doing. You got to change your way and provide parks, open space.
Right.
And I would like to read, to verify that, I'd like to read an excerpt from this.
Please do.
Quote, this is Cleveland's writing. The vast regions yet lying undisturbed between the Mississippi and Pacific comprise such resources of wealth and a variety of sublime and picturesque features of natural scenery as can be seen in no other portion of the earth's surface that is accessible to civilization. This is the raw material which was placed in our hands to be molded into shape for the habitations of a nation, and such as we created must essentially remain for all future time. All coming generations are to inhabit the cities and towns and go to their labors in the street and seek recreation in the parks and pleasure grounds, and be laid to rest in the cemeteries the foundations of which we are laying or preparing to lay. It may not at first appear that the duties and responsibilities dissolving upon us are materially different from those which have attached to the similar work in which our fathers have been engaged throughout the national existence. A little reflection, however, will show that the march of modern improvement has so altered the relative portions of means to ends that the application of creative powers we now possess to the development of new country can no more be governed by the record of the past than the destructive agencies of modern warfare can be directed by military tactics of past ages. That's a little lengthy, but
And that was part of
what is
philosophy,
yeah,
is what you're saying.
and we submit in my research that the reason Cleveland was asked to come and do the master plan for the Minneapolis Park System
And we have an image of that, by the way, so that's very nice to
was
talk about.
because Lorraine read this book
Ah,
and said, there's the kind of guy we need to help with our planning, because he had the vision of
Right.
the future.
and was inspired by that.
So Lorraine hired Cleveland to come and do the master plan for the city.
Fascinating.
Now, in turn, then, by the 1906, Mr. Perry, the first superintendent, reached retirement age,
Right.
and Mr. Loring went back to this philosophy and wanted to get somebody that could come in and put it all together
Right.
and actually build it. And so in his search, he went to my grandfather, found my grandfather in New Haven, who had about finished his program there, had built the Rose Garden, and was implemental in developing a New England superintendent's formation.
Like an association?
Yeah,
of-
an association,
Right.
that's the word. And that he was sort of a prominent young park.
Kind of up and coming and
Yeah.
getting well known.
So we called him out here, and
Yeah.
grandfather didn't, at first wasn't going to come, but he thought about it on the long train ride back,
Yeah,
decided to come. So that's how the foundation was built
right.
for this beautiful city
Yeah.
as we still know it today.
And there's a well-known letter for folks who know about your grandfather that he wrote to Loring, kind of outlining his decision to come.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and it reflects this. You got to remember that in the 1870s, there was like maybe 6 landscape architects.
oh, is that right?
I mean, the whole profession was just beginning to evolve because of the need, because of the expansion of,
Yeah.
of the cities.
Yeah.
And park planning is a very important part of the
Oh,
profession.
sure. But half a dozen at that. I think it all sit around a dinner table together.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
yeah.
Now, as we continue to talk, you mentioned the Rose Garden that your grandfather, the first one in the United States. Public Rose Garden, not a private estate or something.
That's right.
But as we sit here in this house at the old Lindale Farmstead, we're not too far from the Minneapolis Rose Garden.
Which is one of the first things he did when he got here.
Yeah.
And my father, in his footsteps, was director of the National Park Service for 12 years.
That's your father, Conrad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was instrumental in the design and development of the Rose Garden at the White House.
At the White House.
And we have a letter from Jacqueline Kennedy that describes his role in that.
Right. Well, in a moment or two, why don't we maybe talk a little bit more about rose gardens and how they fit in with the public idea for
Sure.
land use and this sort of a thing. Why don't we take a break here, and we're going to hear from, in effect, our host here in the Minneapolis Park System, which is our current superintendent. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about rose gardens and other ideas for how to develop meaningful park space.
Okay.
Okay? So we'll be back right after we hear from our host here and talk more with Ted Wirth.
My name is Merrill Anderson, and I'm the 9th superintendent of the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board. Many people might think that I'm the 8th superintendent because the first superintendent was really very short-lived, only about 6 months, and was not really considered a full-time superintendent. The first superintendent, full-time professional, was William Berry. That began in about 1885. The building behind us is known as the Historic Superintendent's Home. And that is the home that was built by the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board. The first superintendent was Theodore Wirth. He was the first superintendent to live in this house. He is known as really the architect of much of what is the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board system now. It's an exciting house. The last superintendent to live in that was David Fisher. It now is the home of the Minnesota Recreation and Park Association, and we're so excited to have them there because one of the things that that organization has determined that they're going to do is preserve that history of the superintendent's home in the city of Minneapolis and for our state.
Okay, hold on just a second. And we're back. Now, thanks to Merrill Anderson and the folks at the Park Board, they were very helpful in putting this show together. And you might have noticed over her shoulder, of course, is the house in which we're sitting, Ted and I, right now. And that house is here very much on purpose. It was one of the conditions that your grandfather set to coming here. What was that? What else did he want?
When he was in Elizabeth Park I forgot the name.
Oh, in Hartford.
Hartford,
Yeah.
yeah. I would keep wanting to say New Bedford or something, or Hartford. The superintendent was provided a beautiful home, big white square mansion, and so he said, well, he would come to Minneapolis if they'd build him a house in a park in Minneapolis, which Loring agreed to.
Yeah.
And he said also he wanted a car and a chauffeur because Grandpa never did learn to drive.
Yeah.
Even when he, up to his retirement, he still either had a chauffeur or his wife drive him.
That's a good gig.
Yeah, I can't imagine getting the city to give the superintendent a house even.
Not
much
these
less a
days.
car and
I
drive.
think times have changed.
Yes.
Now, I know he had, at least for a while, an office at City Hall.
Oh yeah, he had his one office at City Hall.
Okay.
But most of the work was done here in the basement of this house.
Yeah, kind of his studio, his workshop is the area that he
Yeah,
worked
well,
on.
he had, I think, 4 or 5 landscape architects or engineers down the basement.
Just kept them there, right?
Well, yeah, if you look at the house from the backside, there's a row of windows.
Yeah.
And he had his office there.
Okay.
And what he would do is in the morning he'd get up and have his coffee and breakfast. Then he'd go down there to the office and he would get with his people and line up the work for the day,
Yeah.
whatever design they were working on. Then the chauffeur would pick him up at the back side door because this road used to go all the way through.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't,
Went around the house?
Yeah, there wasn't a turnaround on those
Yeah.
days. And so the chauffeur would take him down to the barns, then to either visit some of the projects or just visit the parks, end up at City Hall.
Mm-hmm.
In the middle of the afternoon, he'd come home and check and see if they got the work done.
Well, he was the superintendent.
Yeah.
He was in charge.
Yeah.
That's right. A moment ago, we took a look at a contemporary look at the Rose Garden here in Minneapolis. Let's talk a little bit about the notion, the idea of a public rose garden. What was the inspiration for that, or what does that mean to a city to have something like
Well, I would guess this inspiration from my grandfather's perspective was people,
that? Yeah.
because he's always believed that, and it's in this goes back to this Cleveland dialogue, that people are what parks are all about. He said the thing that wasn't recognized by most people is the common entity of their work was people, that they observed the people
Yes.
and designed and planned the parks in relationship to whatever typical market there was, we would say. And that's how they, and they'd go out and observe them, how they recreated, where they recreated,
Yeah.
and where they wanted to walk and pass.
So kind of a scientific basis, really. They went out and observed how people
That's
actually
right.
used. It wasn't all in the head. They actually went and saw what people did.
And they got great pleasure out of watching the people use them after they were built. And I can relate to that because when I do it in my practice, I go out afterwards and the project's built and the people using the project don't know I did it.
Yeah.
But I know that I created something that
Right.
was working for the people.
Is that one way you measure sort of the success of some of this
Yep.
land use and land planning, is to see how people actually make use of it?
Oh yeah, that's a very big part of it.
Sure.
And it also pointed out that, as pointed out in Cleveland's book, people in parks are the whole reason for parks,
Yeah.
and that the people in the parks vote the money for parks, so therefore, a roundabout way, it's doing a market study.
That's a good point too. Sure.
You know.
And there's kind of a dual challenge too, to preserve the wonderful system, but then to make sure it gets used.
Yeah, well, that was, if you go back to the 1916,
Yeah.
to the Organic Act establishing the National Park Service,
Okay.
which in a way had preceded a lot of state parks and county parks. but it specifically says that the national park areas will be set aside for the enjoyment and use of the people.
Now, does this go back to another Theodore? Is this Theodore Roosevelt
No.
with some of that national park?
You know, Theodore Roosevelt was just before this.
Okay.
General Grant, wasn't it?
Ulysses?
No, that was the Yellowstone National Park,
Okay.
1870.
Yeah.
But they've developed the National Park Service, and it specifically had that contradiction: preserve and protect,
Right.
but use.
Yeah.
And the Park Service and cities and communities and counties and other agencies all over the country now use that same idea.
Sure.
You hear about all about environmental studies. That's where you evaluate and analyze the resource itself. You don't want to plant it and not use the very thing that makes it worthwhile to set aside as a park to begin with.
Yeah, otherwise it's just a little showcase and
That's
nobody
right.
would use it
Yeah.
otherwise. Well, you made a very good point that Minneapolis at the time, it's easy to sit here now at the turn of the century and think, well, what a beautiful system and the city's grown up all around it. But it wasn't always so. Was Minneapolis unusual in being a city sort of this far removed from everything that had been built up on the East Coast, or were other cities as far west at the time doing things like this?
Well, it was unique because it was one of the first.
Is that right?
Yeah, there was Kansas City and a few other metropolitan areas were also influenced by this book
Okay.
and by the people in the profession that were beginning to evolve.
Right.
The American Society of Landscape Architects was founded in 1900. So the whole thing was sort of the industrialization,
Yeah.
you might almost say a young nation on its march to its destiny. It was going to develop this land to the west, these great open areas and wooded areas.
And a few cities had the prescience to think about that
Yeah.
close to the beginning. I mean, they didn't wait 2 or 3 generations. They really got started as soon as they could.
Minneapolis is a good example, too, because if you read my grandfather's book and the history, there were a lot of people that were against the parks and setting aside any land for parks. I call it those valiant few who outshouted the others, or somehow,
Yeah.
but they made Loring and Barry happened to get a foot in the door and get the master plan done, and you know, it just took off from there because people, all of a sudden, as it did become more industrialized, saw the need for parks.
You mentioned the book your grandfather wrote. Am I correct in what I've heard that that was written right in this house?
Yeah, he retired in 1935, and then he was made superintendent emeritus to write the book.
All right.
So I think that was all of about, all through the war, it's about 10 or 15 years at least,
Sure.
writing the book and gathering all the data.
And I've actually been stopped by someone who knows about our show, stopped down at the Minneapolis Public Library, and he went on rhapsodically about having a copy of that book. I mean, this is now something that people prize as a piece of our history here in Minneapolis.
I have the original manuscript.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. And there's a park now in Minneapolis named after your grandfather, Wirth Park.
Yeah, it was Lindale, not Lindale,
Oh, Glenwood?
Glenwood Park.
That was the old Glenwood.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was named for my grandfather, Theodore Wirth Park, and that has the golf courses, and they used to have the aquatennial ceremony down on the lake,
Yeah?
and they got par 3 golf courses and par 18-hole
Yeah.
standard.
We're going to get some images of that up on our screen as
I
we're
played
talking.
them, played them both, and it's a good course.
Oh, you've done it. All right.
And they used to have ski jumps.
I've seen pictures, yes.
Yeah, but they finally took them down because people were, I think, running toboggans or these boards.
Well, it is a
instead of-
winter climate. People
Yeah,
wanted
we
to...
go kill somebody
Yeah,
coming
yeah.
off. Anyhow,
Sure.
But
And I
it's
think
a
we have an
multi-
image later of somebody actually on one of those ski jumps.
Yeah.
And the chalet, there's a neat little story about the chalet.
well, it was again grandfather's Swiss influence
Yeah.
because he was from Switzerland, and they wanted to build a chalet out there,
And it was reminiscent of...
reminiscence of the Swiss chalet.
Yeah.
And that's for the golf and the winter sport. We were out there this last January, and Grandpa would be very, very pleased because there were hundreds of people skating and sledding, and
There's that great hill there
yeah,
to slide down in the winter.
that's what the first first green.
You probably know better than I am
Yeah.
how to golf. Ted, let's take another break and come back and talk specifically about the Minneapolis system, some of the highlights here, and I know you've done some work here in our system
Yes.
as well. So let's talk about that in a moment. But first, folks, let's go out and take a look at a wonderful montage that Sherry Nolan put together of different elements, different parks throughout the Minneapolis system over time. It's a nice montage. Stay tuned and we'll be right back. And we're back. That was a wonderful montage, and if you're like I am, it's just wonderful to see some of the historical record, especially of our park system here. You are watching Inside Minneapolis. I'm your host, Phill Lindsay, and we're talking with Ted Wirth, grandson of Theodore. And I thought now we might talk a little bit about the Minneapolis Park System itself. To be honest, I think a lot of people take it for granted. Busy lives, they've got a lot going on. They may go down by themselves with friends or family and just sort of take a quick walk or something, and they forget the fact that this is a park system. It was intentional. There were reasons that it's like this. And you brought up a point as we were chatting when we were looking at the montage about the value of tying in the north side as well as the south side, and then of course over into northeast Minneapolis. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, as we talked about earlier, I was the designer and we built Boom Island.
Yes, in northeast Minneapolis.
And then we did another study was for the bikeway connection through North Minneapolis
Oh, all
on the
right.
railroad tracks.
Yeah.
Because we found there were an awful lot during the study, a lot of abandoned railroad tracks because the nature of the development is changing. It's going to more condos and restaurants and that sort of urban development. Well, in doing that, we looked at the city as a whole, and there weren't any big areas left, so to speak.
Right.
But there are areas out there. I know, well, in the north side, they could get more than just the right-of-ways. In Boom Island, there's about twice as much land yet to be developed.
Oh, I was unaware of that. So there's more space.
That's already
Contiguous
owned.
to it?
Yes,
Oh,
on
interesting.
the back side of it.
All right.
And it wraps around down of St. Anthony, the island, you know.
Which is a historical
Right.
feature of the city in itself.
So there are places out there, but they're becoming scarcer and they're becoming more expensive.
Yeah.
I think with the change in urban development, with more and more apartments and high-density townhouses and things, I think they should, and I'm sure they are, talking about park and open space as a responsibility of the developer.
Yes.
It's to his advantage because the value of those houses or restaurants or whatever are enhanced by the open space park environment. You just take a look at the development of the homes around the two lakes.
Yes.
Calhoun and Harriet.
Yep.
Look at those pay for themselves.
And there can be a nice partnership between the private sector keeping green and landscaped areas in mind
That's right.
with the public investment as well.
That's what makes it beautiful. And all the trees, of course, that's another favorite of Grandpa's was his trees.
Well, and again, I think we may take it for granted, Ted, but we have an urban forest here in large part because of Theodore Wirth.
Yes, he pushed it.
Yeah.
He got it started.
Yeah.
Well, he was. If you'd given him a blank check, he'd have had all sorts of other projects. He was one of those
I can imagine.
people. But
Sure. And he'd helped get the trees going in New York City's Central Park.
yeah, well, when he of course was educated in Switzerland, did his apprentice as a horticulturist. In fact, Cleveland and a lot of the early landscape architects were really horticulturists, and they called themselves landscape architects. I call myself an architect of the land, which is what the French call themselves, architectes paysagistes. That means architects of the land.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, lost my train of thought there. I got to
Oh, but the urban forest.
The urban forest.
The importance of the trees to the landscape.
Well, you just have to look at the places in Minneapolis that have already done that.
Yeah.
In downtown, on the riverfront,
Mm-hmm.
those places on the other side of the
Yes.
St. Anthony, you know, they're pretty high priced and return a lot of
They're getting that way, that's right.
taxes, but they're enhanced by the open space,
Yeah.
by the park feeling. So when people can come down the elevator and go for a walk in the park, no matter where they are in the city. I think that's the thing. And the other thing is to be sure and protect and preserve what you have.
Mm-hmm.
In Hartford, Connecticut, as an example, where this was just 10 years, within the last 10 years, the city engineers wanted it was convenient to use part of Elizabeth Park and the Rose Garden as a parkway. They were going to destroy the garden.
This was their intention.
Was their intention.
You're not telling us that it happened, though.
No, it didn't happen because the LaRose Society of Hartford
Yeah.
got up in arms and blocked it. And they not only did that, but they then restored the whole garden. So if you go back there now, it's the same species of roses, the same arbors are
That
there
Theodore
now
worked on?
that Theodore designed.
Introduced to that.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
So, but you've got to protect those sort of areas because
Yeah.
they're becoming more and more precious as cities infill.
Right.
I mean, we talk about growth of cities. I think you're going to see a big movement in city planning where parks will become even more important because of the infill.
Right, and the density that's happening
That's
now in
right.
cities. It seems there's a movement, maybe a nascent movement for people to come back a bit from those exurbs and those suburbs and come back
Exactly.
into the city.
They're finding the commute isn't as
Right.
fun as it thought it might be.
You just mentioned commute. In the early days of the Minneapolis system, I heard you say once that people would get there any way they could. They'd take the trolley, they'd take those early automobiles.
Well, you have to remember the automobile wasn't as prevalent amongst people
Right.
in those days, but when the trolleys came out,
Yeah.
and it wasn't just Minneapolis, but other cities around the nation in California, people used to get out to the suburbs.
Right.
And this, of course, was where Harriet and Calhoun would be the suburbs of early Minneapolis, not a part of the city.
Yeah, they weren't surrounded by houses in
No,
those days. Yeah.
they were the threshold of the hinterland,
Yeah.
the wilderness out there.
Yeah. There might have been a crossroads somewhere,
And
but
they built a trolley, everybody's going to get on the trolley.
yeah.
And it's just because they didn't have cars
Yeah. And that allowed them to come out and recreate.
for the day
Yeah.
and go back home.
And then head back. In a climate like ours, Ted, and I know you have literally done work around the world,
Yes.
a number of continents, so you've seen different ecosystems and different climatic areas. Are there seasonal considerations when someone like yourself or your grandfather, or your father for that matter, are working on a system? Would things be planned differently for people to use a given park or?
Well, there are parts of the world like San Diego and Southern California that don't have seasons, Hawaii.
Okay,
So you plan for what they call year-round use.
yeah,
And if it's a seasonal area with snow like Minneapolis,
yeah,
then you plan for the winter activities we call multi-use.
sure,
Because, for instance, at Theodore Wirth Park, the ski hill, sledding hill, in the summertime is a fairway for a golf course.
right,
And there's little league fields are only in short time of the year. Maybe in
Yeah.
the fall time they'll be used for something else. So yes,
so you got to plan for both.
we look at seasonality
Yeah. Yeah.
because we want to encourage use on a year-round basis.
Right. Now, and to some extent, does that make choices as to what kind of grasses or meadows or vegetation you might have, because it might get intense use for part of the year, and would or wouldn't have time to sort of grow back?
Oh yes, absolutely. This hill right out here in front of the house.
Yeah.
It's a perfect example. It's a sledding hill. It's been a sledding hill since I was born,
Yeah.
and it's still in good shape. So
Yeah.
the maintenance people know what grasses grow,
But-
how to maintain it.
Yep. And then as we sit here, I've noticed they've got it blocked out for soccer fields, and of course there is a ball field down at the other end.
That's
down
right.
there. So
And
it's,
then when I was here in January, they had it clear and there was ice skating.
yeah. Could we shift gears briefly for just a moment and talk about Minnihaha Falls and Park? Do you have any memories of that yourself, or what perhaps your grandfather thought of its importance to the Minneapolis system?
Well, it was an anchor
Yeah.
at one end of the loop road, the parkways, and also the river road which is now being implemented. But in those days, it was just a dream.
Okay.
So, and it's, you know, it's such a beautiful area. If you walk down into the gullies and all around,
Oh, yes.
pretty nice.
And in the winter, speaking of seasons, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but some of us actually have gone up behind the frozen waterfall
Oh, really?
and walked in there and been in a magical land. It's wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. One ought not to do that, I believe, but
Yes.
the memories are grand.
Yes.
Yeah, that's good. Ted, let's take another break here. I'd like to come back. You mentioned earlier in our conversation about kind of the political struggle of getting people behind doing this. There was some resistance
Oh, yeah.
in your grandfather's day. Let's talk about that in a moment. I also want to talk a little bit about your work that you're doing both around the world and right here in Minneapolis. But first, this is kind of a treat because the crew went down to the offices of the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board and talked with Rachel Ramadhyani, who's a landscape architect with the system. And she's actually, I think, very professionally thrilled to be working with some of the very plans that Ted's grandfather put together. So let's go see Rachel in her office.
I'm Rachel Ramadhyani. I'm a landscape architect and project manager with the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, and I manage park projects of all sizes, from small tot lots to large master plans. We are sort of at the nerve center of the park board itself. We're standing in the boardroom where the Board of Commissioners meets pretty much on a weekly basis to pass and discuss measures of all sorts. And around us are the offices of finance, planning, and other park board departments. Well, we've got some of the historic park plans, which we're very fortunate to have in our plan archives. Plans for the first round of creation of the parks in our system. A number of them were directly designed or supervised by Theodore Wirth, who of course was superintendent of the park system, but also a landscape architect, and a number of these bear his signature. And so it's a very fortunate and exciting thing that we have these in our archives. The first one that I brought out here is a plan for the improvement of Kenwood Park back in 1926, and it does bear Theodore Wirth's signature as the supervising landscape architect on the project. It shows some of the improvements that were proposed at that time, especially to do with forestry improvements and athletic fields. This next plan is a plan for the southern part of Lake Calhoun, again signed by Theodore Wirth from 1919. And this was shortly after the dredging of Lake Calhoun was completed, and it shows the creation of a lot of the features that we associate with Lake Calhoun now. Lakewood Cemetery is at one side, and William Berry Park is shown, Lake Calhoun Parkway, of course, which was envisioned by Cleveland in his Grand Round system. But this is a very interesting plan, and it's part of a set of construction documents that we have for Lake Calhoun from 1919. This final set is a plan for the dredging and planting of Lake Nokomis, and it also dates from 1919, which was clearly a pretty busy year for Theodore. And this one has particular meaning for me because I have also been working on planting restoration activities at Lake Nokomis, and when I pulled this plan out of our files to consult it as a historical reference and to in fact try to bring back to Nokomis some of the features that Theodore Wirth had designed originally, I saw his name on this plan and his signature, and I felt such a powerful sense of connection with Theodore Wirth, myself as another landscape architect, a century later almost, working on the same park projects, following in the footsteps in some small way of one of the greats of our profession, and it was a very powerful emotional experience for me. We're very fortunate to have him as one of our founders, and to have his plans still with us and his parks.
Interesting in retrospect. And we want to thank Rachel and our crew for going down there and sharing with us her professional enthusiasm about her work with some of the living legacy of Theodore Wirth. And some moments ago, Ted, you and I mentioned that it's not always easy to make something like this happen. There are politics involved. And Theodore had to enlist civic leaders to make this happen. You want to talk a little bit about the challenges he had?
Well, it was a little before my time in 1906.
Yeah, a little bit.
But it's my understanding that he would convince the leaders of industry in this community, Pillsbury and others, to run for the park board, and it would help with their public image for their products. and they would run and get elected, and he sort of then worked with that board to overcome some of the politics with the city council,
Right.
others. I don't know the details, I just,
Right.
the way it was told to me. And, but politics is a part of community life, unfortunately sometimes.
Oh, sure.
And he was a master at working with people, making them comfortable with him and his ideas. My father was the same. I was telling a story last night about, I had a hearing, a congressional hearing once on a big individual project we were working on in the East. And I went sat there in front of the Senate hearing, and they said, are you any relation to Connie Wirth? It was my father.
Yeah.
I said, yes, my father, and it took them about 30 minutes for each senator to tell me how great my father was, because he inherited from his father, my grandfather, that political ability without being a politician
Right.
to work things through the system
Yep.
and manage to expand the park system, get the trees planted, get the playgrounds in, keep off the grass signs, all those things that he's attributed
Well,
to.
it's the third P in this. It's people, parks, and politics.
That's right.
You got to get them all going there.
Oh yeah,
Sure.
it's a fact of life,
Yeah.
and but you don't want to let it rule. The politics rule it, because then it'll get into
Right.
non-productive ends.
Did I hear an anecdote that he also had to deal with the unions who had some reservations about some of this?
It's covered in his book.
Yeah.
It's interesting reading. There was a struggle, because there were a lot of people that swore parks were a waste of time, because Minneapolis was never going to grow bigger than to Lake Harriet.
Okay.
And of course, anybody in his right mind that saw what was happening to
Yeah.
this country in the late 1800s and the 19th is obvious it's going to be a big metropolitan area.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And these people just thought it was a waste of money.
Yeah.
And I've read it several times, but I don't remember the details, but it's worth reading.
Sure.
And because that's the other thing. The Clevelands and the Theodore Wirths and other park people of those days didn't have government agencies behind them. They didn't have grant programs. They didn't have land and water conservation funds like we have today.
Right. That are established.
That are established. In those days, there was everybody for himself.
Yeah.
And you had to go out and invent your own way of getting money for your parks, not just to buy them, but to build them and to maintain them.
So in essence, they're competing with other interests, which might have legitimate interests.
Oh, yes.
But they had to get out there and make the case and win the converts. And it sounds clever to get people like Pillsbury on the board, because then they're invested.
Yeah, well, one time I said it was, I didn't know all the details, but it reminded me a little bit about a guy going into the court with a stacked jury, see.
Yeah. Yeah, well, sure, because if he's got all his buddies sitting on the board like that. That's
I don't know if it was quite that way, but
No.
all his buddies, but he was able to show people the value of parks and recreation
Yeah.
to the economic well-being of this community, which I think has been proven over and over and still applies. People live here because they like it. It's pretty.
That's right.
It's got a lot of parks, and it's a beautiful place to live. It's a Garden of Eden.
Yeah. And the land values clearly appreciate where this kind of space is developed.
And even when you drive in the parts of town that aren't large homes, like around the lakes
Yeah.
and big landscapes, they're smaller, more modest homes, they still have trees.
Yeah.
You know, it's not quite as big a park, but they have scattering parks for the neighborhood parks to serve those areas.
That's right. And you're in practice. There is
Yes.
an entity known as Wirth Design,
Yes.
based in
Billings.
Billings, Montana. Let me move into that conversation by asking you about public input. Now, we're talking historically in your grandfather's time, but you have to deal with it too. Is there more, do you sense that there's more public input now, more people kind of piping up and having their 2 cents?
Well, for two reasons. First of all, people are concerned. The national agencies and the private organizations, Land Trust, Sierra Club, have all raised an awareness
Yeah.
in the people generally about urban sprawl, the need for preservation, the need for stopping developing and filling with concrete all these wonderful resources that Cleveland talked about.
Right.
But it's also written into what they call regulations, land use regulations. I mean, I'm doing a subdivision in Jackson or a subdivision someplace else, and it has a big segment in for public input, starting at the beginning of the project, with allowances for adjustments depending on what the public wants.
So it's written right into the
It's written right
to the
into
agreement.
regulations. It's written right here in Minneapolis too. When we did Boom Island, we had to go over and meet 4 or 5 times with the local citizens. They were going to be directly affected within a certain half mile or mile radius.
Absolutely. And
So it's important, and it goes back to the same thing. Olmsted said that his father and my grandfather observed the people. That's what public input is. We go out and look at the existing parks in that neighborhood. We asked the people in when we did the trail system for the North Minneapolis Pikeway. We had big meetings. I mean, big people, numbers came out in support of or against or for alternatives or whatever. And you listen to them.
yeah.
And there's a lot of astute people out there.
And they care. They're passionate about their area.
A cute story, I did an environmental study for the Denver Regional Transportation System years ago. And the very first meeting, one of the reasons we got the job was that we stressed that we would do a very thorough public input. We got the first meeting, and there must have been 200 people there. And this one guy at the back of the room got up and said, I want it known right from the start. He was represent the Sierra Club. I want it known right from the start. We're just flat out against this plan.
That's how he began the conversation.
Yeah, that's it. He got up and made that statement. And I said, all right, we'll make you chairman of the committee. Which we did. And after he saw the process we went through, he stood up in public in support of the plan, because we adjusted to what the concerns of the public were. It sounds like just common sense, but
Ted, that sounds a lot like something Theodore Wirth might have done.
yes.
Get him right involved, get him the chairmanship there.
He didn't teach me exactly, except
Yeah.
through osmosis of
Yeah.
being up here in the summers with him. And sort of, when you're a kid, you don't pay attention to learning anything, but you do. When
You're imbued with it, though.
That's right.
You're there, you see it.
Well, with my father and my grandfather, and by the way, my uncle, Walter, was involved with the Pennsylvania State Parks and then in charge of the Salem, Oregon parks.
Fascinating. And I know that on your mother's side, too, there were people involved with green and growing things as well.
Holman Olson Florist and Park Nurseries over in St. Paul.
In St. Paul, that's right. So another local connection here to the Twin Cities.
Yeah, they were horticulturists, you see.
Yeah, well, let's just spend a quick moment, because I know you've worked in some very interesting and diverse settings. I think some early work in Yellowstone, and you've done the
Yes.
Grand Tetons, you've been
Yeah.
involved.
I was the park planner for Grand Teton National Park for 10 years.
Wow.
And then I was a project manager in charge of all design and construction for Yellowstone for 3 years. And we've done a lot of work for concessionaires up there
Yeah.
and building public facilities.
And you had a big hand in the North Dakota.
Yeah, the North Dakota
State Park System.
Park System plan,
Yeah.
that was fun.
That was fun.
To study the whole state of North Dakota. There's some people from Montana that isn't worth much, but it is. A lot of beautiful areas, and we identified them and put them in perspective and what the needs of the people, because we met with all the local counties. It took 2 years to get that study done.
Well, you tell the folks in Montana they better pay attention to North Dakota, because from here, that's their front door.
Yeah.
We got to go through there to get to Montana. So,
That's right.
Listen, let's take another break and come back, and I want to talk about stewardship.
Okay.
A little bit about what our responsibilities are with this great legacy of Theodore Wirth and anything that we invest in public parks like this. But first, as you know, we have our feature, Who the Heck Is That, on each show. And let's go out right now and get some answers that maybe aren't quite right on the mark. And then we'll be back.
It's like Theodore Roosevelt.
I'm gonna say, yeah, okay, I was gonna say Truman, but no, more Roosevelt.
Is it Thomas Jefferson?
It's Theodore Roosevelt.
Theodore Roosevelt, he's right.
Harry Truman.
Oh, not Jackson.
Grant.
That's definitely Harry Truman.
Truman.
Theodore Roosevelt.
Cuban Humphrey.
I don't know.
Be right back with you. And we're back, and of course, a little bit later, we will get the right answer to that question. I want to talk with you, Ted, a little bit about stewardship. In the too brief a time we've had here to get to understand a little bit about the ground, why your grandfather came here and what some of the ideas were that he wanted to work with and some of the things that we get to enjoy now. Here we have this great legacy, and there are people working hard today to keep going with this park system, but all of us, it would seem to me, have a role to play in stewardship. And not necessarily just about Minneapolis, but who is responsible for maintaining a park system, whether it's here in Minneapolis or a big system like up in North Dakota? Who ought to be paying attention to that?
People.
People. Enough said.
Parks are for people, and people should be more interested in participation in the process. I was explaining about in regulations.
Yeah.
Talk about preserving and using. People are going to be the driving force in the end because they're going to be asked to pay for it.
Good point. Yeah.
And we can't just dictate that we save something, although, I mean, even national monuments, national parks, oftentimes weren't just handed to the government. They had to go through a very rigorous planning and acquisition stage. And the people have a big role in it, and as we go along, the more and more importance than they used to.
And I know you care about education as well.
Oh, yes.
That the kind of stories that we're talking about right now, with your grandfather as one individual, but other folks that are doing other work, there are stories to be told, and the young people need to hear about this.
Well, it's what we call interpretation. In the National Park Service, back when I was serving there, there was a sort of a switch from museums to interpretive centers. If you've ever gone to a national park, now you'll find interpretive centers rather than museums. Because museums were just simply collections of artifacts or whatever of an era or a story. But that's gone because people would come in and leave and they wouldn't have learned a thing. They'd have seen something.
It'd be kind of passive in the old way.
So that's key, and you've got to start them to meet grade school. And this is what we've been talking with the library about in their new building. Emphasizing parks. They have other areas of the public life they want to emphasize with interpretive programs, interpretive exhibits that help answer these questions so that these young people have more of an appreciation of what it took to build, in the case of the parks, what we've got.
Right.
And so that's my answer.
That's a good one. I know you've had some thoughts about what they might be able to do with our library system to preserve some of the historical record. I also heard that you had some interest at one time on Boom Island. We were talking about that earlier, that maybe there could be an interpretive facility there.
Yes.
Is that still a dream you have for that?
Yeah, the land is there.
Yeah.
There's an old railroad bridge that connects Boom Island with the historic St. Anthony. I'm sorry.
The old community there. Yeah.
And there's that land to the east of that, all the way around, that's empty. It's owned by the park department. And we had wanted to put a railroad roundhouse there, or a part of one, along with a plaza and a trolley that would go from Boom Island on down the east side of the river by trolley and back, using the existing railroad right-of-way, pardon me. I felt at the time, and I still do, that railroading was a big influence and played a major part in the development of the city. Not only railroading to connect with the Great Plains out to Montana and Wyoming, but also regionally right close in. I mean, Boom Island in 1904 was a railroad yard, switching yard.
Isn't that where it got the name? That's where the boom came from?
Well, there was, I think there was a small island, and they hooked up a boom to pile all the junk behind
and
make a bigger island, which was fine until we went to build it. And then we ran into everything from old brick, tar paper roofs, plastic, about anything you can imagine trying to dig the foundations for the buildings. But the library, in fact, we were talking with them now about their ideas for interpretation, and I was very pleased to see their thinking is right up to snuff.
That'd be lovely. Let me ask you a kind of a philosophical question. For those of us that care, and there are many of us that care about our park system, how can we measure how well we're doing in preserving the legacy of Theodore Wirth and all the people that have worked in the parks? How do we measure?
Public response.
Yeah.
I mean, they'll tell you whether the swings are worn out or seesaws are worn out or something's not right. They'll also, in the public meetings, tell you generally what they're like, even if the public meeting is on a specific subject, such as the Carter Lake North Minneapolis Bikeway study. We had some big public meetings, and they came with all sorts of ideas, directly and indirectly related to the parks in that area. So you track that, and you can always do surveys and things like that. But it still goes back to.
But that kind of input itself is a way to measure.
Oh yes.
What Theodore and others set in motion.
There's a lot of people out there that like to be heard.
Yeah.
And they get up and give some pretty good speeches at those public meetings.
Tell you what, let's be diplomatic and leave the present administration out, because there may be, we all work together here, but let's go back a little bit in history. How has Minneapolis done, say, in the, I'm just going to make up 60, 70, 80 years since Theodore Wirth got started here? How has Minneapolis been doing, in your opinion? This is just a...
Well, my opinion can be reflected in what I wrote into the retirement book for Dave Fisher.
Okay.
I said I happened to know Dave and got to know him pretty well. Every time he came here, he let Dad go into the house and test the third step to see if it still squeaked.
All right.
But anyhow, I wrote and told Dave, well, in my opinion, Dave, you left it better than you found it. Grandfather would have been very pleased.
Can't ask for more than that. And for those who don't know, David Fisher is the immediate past superintendent of the Minneapolis system.
You don't measure by, a lot of people do, but you don't measure by the quantity of land. You measure by the quality of the development.
And then the use that people put to it.
And getting back to your word stewardship, which is very big in our profession, because we feel we are stewards of the land.
Yeah.
Good Lord isn't going to make any more.
That's true.
And so, I mean, what you see is what you got.
Yeah.
And we're going to infill this urban areas, and we're going to have to pay closer attention to detail.
Yeah.
And we're not going to be able to have big, wide, open parks necessarily. I was talking to somebody last night about the down around, what was an arena with some concrete batch plants connected with the moving of the Guthrie Theater.
Oh, down around the
Parade
Stadium.
Yeah,
there's
and
the ice arena.
There are areas like that
Yeah.
are going through turmoil now. What do we do with this
absolutely.
and that?
Yeah.
And so this is where we have to be ever watchful
Right.
for park spaces, open space.
Good point. And you just mentioned that area down around the Parade Stadium and the sculpture garden there by the Walker Arts Center. Across the street from that, of course, is Loring Park.
Yes.
And maybe we can take a look at a clip of that, named after, of course, Charles Loring. And that's kind of our central park here in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about Loring Park as a
beautiful park.
place to bring people together?
Just a nice passive park in the middle of the city. And,
Yeah.
you know, people haven't changed, even from back in the 1800s. And I learned this on a project you were mentioning, some of my worldwide projects. I did the first national park for Saudi Arabia, called Asir National Park.
Yeah.
And I've been doing over 80 urban parks. They call them gardens in Kuwait. I did over 80 gardens in Kuwait for the city of Kuwait. And we found out, and we had to do surveys and questionnaires of the neighborhoods and things. These were all neighborhood parks. And we found that the people wanted the same thing. They wanted a place to go where it was shady, where there was some space where their kids could play soccer. and you could have almost written the script
Yeah.
from what Americans do. There's still the people out there.
Yeah.
They're still, working every day to make a living, make the payments on their house,
And it's-
live with the daily problems of the kids and where do they play kickball, and
Yeah.
the culture is the same in essence.
Around
They play
the world.
more soccer than they do
Yeah.
here, but it's catching up with them. But it's they're for instance, around the parks they want fences so the balls don't go into the street. I mean, those
Sure.
type of things.
Sure.
And some of the playground equipment are all produced here in the United States. We use them over there.
Ted Wirth, I want to thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk with
My
you about
pleasure.
your work and that of your
Thank you.
grandfather, Theodore.
Thank you.
It's been great. Well, let's head out now and get that answer to our question, who the heck is that? And then we'll be back.
Hi, my name is Joan Berthiaume, and I know who that picture is. That's Theodore Wirth. He was our Minneapolis Parks superintendent from 1906 to 1935. Charles Loring hired him to come to Minneapolis and develop the master plans that had been conceived by Horace Cleveland in 1883 for a series of parks, parkways, and boulevards in the city of Minneapolis, including our now familiar chain of lakes. Theodore Wirth also established our playground parks and recreation programs, coining the phrase, "Parks are for people." When he retired in 1935, Theodore Wirth had tripled the size of the Minneapolis Park System, and Minneapolis was known as the most beautiful city in the United States. It still is, don't you think?
Well, that's it for this edition of Inside Minneapolis. Hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have putting it together. And we want to give a special thanks to Joan Berthiaume for her help in putting this show together. She was wonderful. Now, at the end of the show, we have our usual catalog of resources, and alongside it, a nice image of Theodore Wirth with his grandson, Ted, wading in a lake. And of course, along our credits, we also like to put some images, and we've got a nice montage of different park users throughout Minneapolis in different seasons and over the years here in Minneapolis. If you want to find out a little bit more about this topic, give us a call on our hotline, 673-2234. And of course, next month we'll take another look inside Minneapolis. Until then, I'm Phill Lindsay. We'll see you later.